I can hear. I can hear.
You can hear? Oh, my baby?
9 years, and she had never heard a single sound. Not her father's voice, not the rain on the windows of that enormous house, not the music he played in the evenings, hoping somehow that sound could find a way through. Lily Hale was born deaf, and every doctor who ever looked at her said the same thing. Nothing we can do. Accept it. Move on. Think about the last sound you heard. Maybe it was a car passing outside your window. Maybe it was the voice of someone you love calling your name from the other room. Maybe it was music drifting in from somewhere down the street, or rain tapping against glass, or the ordinary hum of a refrigerator in a quiet kitchen at midnight. You didn't think twice about it. You probably didn't even register it as a gift. You just heard it, and then you moved on with your life. Now I want you to imagine that you never heard any of it. Not one single note, not one syllable, not one beat of silence broken by the world outside. I want you to imagine living 9 full years on this earth and never once hearing the voice of your own father say your name, never hearing him laugh, never hearing him cry in the room next to yours at 2 in the morning when he thought no one was paying attention, never hearing him whisper through the crack in your bedroom door, "Good night, sweetheart. I love you more than anything in this world." Imagine living in a silence so complete, so unbroken, so total, that the only sounds you have ever known existed in the tips of your fingers, in the soles of your feet, and the vibrations you could feel in floorboards when someone walked too close. That was Lily Hale's life. Every single day of it. For 9 years. 9 years. And she had never heard a single sound. Not her father's voice, not the rain on the windows of that enormous house, not the music he played in the evenings, hoping somehow that sound could find a way through. Lily Hale was born deaf, and every doctor who ever looked at her said the same thing. Nothing we can do. Accept it. Move on. Her father, Marcus Hale, had a net worth of $400 million. He had flown to 6 countries. He had paid specialists more money per hour than most people earn in a year. He had begged, he had donated. He had threatened to fund entire research departments if they could just find an answer. Every single one of them told him the same thing, and he believed them. He believed them right up until the morning a 31-year-old housekeeper walked into his kitchen, looked at his daughter across the room, and saw something that 9 years and 100 specialists had completely missed. What Grace Osei noticed, and what she chose to do about it, would cost her everything she had, and give Lily Hale back a world she had never known. Stay with me, because this story is going to take you somewhere you are not ready for. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus Hale was not a man who accepted losing. He had never learned how. He was born in 1971 in a row house in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the second of 4 children, went to a father who drove a delivery truck and a mother who cleaned offices 3 nights a week after working the front desk at a dental practice during the day. They were not poor in the way that breaks families completely, but they were poor enough that Marcus understood from the time he was 8 years old that the gap between where he was and where he wanted to be was something only he could close. He was not the most gifted student in his class. He was not the most athletic, not the most charming, not the most likely to be voted anything in a yearbook. What Marcus Hale had, the thing that set him apart from every other kid in his neighborhood who had the same dreams and none of the means, was an absolute refusal to stop moving forward. He studied when other kids slept. He took on jobs when other kids played. He read books on business and economics borrowed from the public library, returning them dog-eared and annotated in pencil because he couldn't afford to buy his own copies. And when he graduated from the University of Connecticut on a partial academic scholarship with a degree in finance and $32,000 in student loans, he did not move back home. He moved to Manhattan with $1,100 in a checking account and a plan that existed in 3 pages of a spiral notebook he carried everywhere. By the time he was 35, that plan had produced a real estate investment firm that managed over $2 billion in assets. By 40, he had the kind of wealth that insulated a person from almost every conceivable form of failure. Almost every kind. because the one failure Marcus could not buy his way out of, or the one problem that did not respond to resources or persistence or force of will, was the silence surrounding his daughter. Lily was born in April of 2013. Her mother, Sandra, a landscape architect from Portland, Oregon, whom Marcus had met at a conference in Chicago and married inside of 14 months, went into labor 6 weeks early, and Lily came into the world small and furious and absolutely determined to exist, weighing 4 pounds and 11 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a set of lungs that, based on the force of her initial cry, suggested she had plenty to say about the indignity of being born early. She passed every test in the neonatal unit except one. The newborn hearing screening, the routine one they give every baby within the first day or two of life, came back flagged. The nurses told Marcus and Sandra what they tell most parents in that moment, that it was very likely just fluid in the ear canal from delivery, that it happened all the time, that a follow-up appointment in a few weeks would almost certainly show perfectly normal hearing. They were calm about it, professional, reassuring, and Marcus, who was not a man prone to catastrophizing, took them at their word. He drove Sandra and Lily home from the hospital on a Tuesday in April, with the windows down and music playing low on the radio, and he told himself everything was going to be fine. He was wrong. The follow-up appointment 2 weeks later did not show normal hearing. The auditory brainstem response test, which measures how the brain responds to sound by tracking electrical activity along the hearing nerve, showed almost nothing in either ear. The audiologist who reviewed the results referred them immediately to a pediatric ear, nose, and throat specialist who ordered additional testing, who referred them to another specialist who conducted an MRI, who sat them down in a small office with a window overlooking a parking structure and told them, in the measured and careful language of someone who delivers devastating news for a living, that Lily had profound bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. Both ears, severe, almost certainly permanent. The inner ear structures appeared to have formed incorrectly in utero, likely the result of a genetic variation, though further testing would be needed to determine the specific cause. Marcus sat in that chair and heard the doctor's voice from somewhere very far away. He heard words like congenital and irreversible, and quality of life and resources available. He heard Sandra's breathing change next to him. He heard the fluorescent light overhead buzzing faintly at a frequency the doctor could not have known was the only sound in that room Marcus was truly registering. He did not cry in the office. He was not a man who cried in offices. He shook the doctor's hand. He thanked her for her time. He drove Sandra home and carried Lily's car seat inside and set it on the kitchen counter and looked at his daughter, who was 16 days old and asleep and completely unaware that the world had just become a very different place for everyone in her orbit. And then Marcus Hale went into the garage, sat down on the cold concrete floor with his back against the wall, and cried until he couldn't anymore. Why, he cried for Lily. He cried for the voice she would never hear. He cried for Sandra, who he already knew was going to handle this differently than he would, and for the distance that would grow between them because of it, even though he couldn't have told you then exactly how he knew. And then he wiped his face, stood up, walked back inside, and did what Marcus Hale always did when confronted with a problem. He started making a plan. The plan in those early months was aggressive and thorough. Marcus hired a pediatric audiologist who specialized in early intervention for profoundly deaf children. He had hearing aids fitted for Lily at 5 weeks old, tiny devices that sat behind her ears and amplified what little residual hearing, if any, remained. He enrolled the family in an early intervention program through the state of Connecticut. He hired a speech and language pathologist who came to the house 3 days a week. He found a therapist who worked specifically with families navigating new diagnoses of childhood hearing loss. He read everything he could find on the subject: scientific journals and parent memoirs and clinical guidelines and forum threads written by other fathers at 2 a.m. who were trying to hold themselves together. He was present, he was attentive, he was doing everything right, and Sandra was doing something different. Sandra was learning American Sign Language from a tutor who came twice a week, and she was bringing home books from the library about deaf culture, and she was connecting with other families in the deaf community. And she was beginning to talk about Lily's deafness, not as a problem to be solved, but as a characteristic to be understood and embraced. The tension between those two approaches, Marcus's relentless push toward cure and Sandra's quiet insistence that maybe the goal wasn't to fix their daughter, but to reach her, was not something either of them named directly for the first 18 months. It was present in the way they talked about Lily's future. It was present in the choices they argued over softly, carefully, in the evenings after Lily was in bed. And it was present in the growing silences between them, which felt, in their own way, almost as heavy as the silence surrounding their daughter. When Lily was 2 years old, Marcus flew the family to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore to meet with a Cochlear implant team. Now, Cochlear implants are not hearing aids. They do not simply amplify sound. They bypass the damaged portions of the inner ear entirely and deliver electrical signals directly to the auditory nerve, allowing the brain to perceive the experience of sound even when the cochlea itself cannot function. The technology had been available for children in the United States since the early 1990s, and by the time Marcus was sitting in the consultation room at Johns Hopkins, with Lily on his knee, it had been given to tens of thousands of children worldwide, with outcomes that ranged from transformative to complicated. The team at Hopkins was thorough and honest. They explained that Lily was a candidate for implantation. They explained the surgery, the recovery, the activation process, the years of intensive auditory therapy that would follow. They also explained carefully that cochlear implants did not restore normal hearing. They provided a representation of sound that the brain then learned to interpret, a process that varied enormously from child to child and required an enormous commitment of time and therapy and patience. They were not selling miracles. They were offering a tool, and they were very clear about what the tool could and could not do. Marcus wanted the surgery scheduled before they left the building. Sandra wanted to go home and think. That conversation in the hotel room that night was the longest and most painful of their marriage, and by the time Lily was implanted at age 2.5, in her right ear, as Sandra had ultimately agreed, reserving the left ear in case technology improved, the marriage was already fracturing along fault lines that neither of them had the energy left to repair. The cochlear implant gave Lily access to sound. That is the precise and careful language the specialists used, and it is important to understand what it means and what it does not mean. Access to sound is not the same as hearing. The signal that a cochlear implant delivers to the auditory nerve is an electrical approximation of the acoustic world, processed through a microphone in a speech processor, worn behind the ear and translated into patterns of stimulation. For many children, with time and therapy and exposure, the brain learns to make remarkable sense of that signal. They learn to recognize speech. They learn to follow conversations. Some learn to use the telephone and listen to music and function in noisy environments with what appears, to the casual observer, to be nearly typical hearing. But the outcomes are highly individual. They depend on the age of implantation, the cause of the deafness, the quality of the auditory therapy the child receives, the neurological architecture of each specific brain, and factors that even the most experienced audiologists cannot always predict or explain. Lily received the implant. She went through the activation, the charged and emotional moment when the device is switched on for the first time and the child encounters sound. Marcus had watched videos of activations online, hundreds of them, children's faces registering shock and wonder, and sometimes fear at the sudden presence of a world they had never known. He had cried watching nearly everyone. He was desperate for that moment with Lily, desperate in a way that had become the central fact of his emotional life. And Lily did respond to the activation. Her eyes widened. Her face changed. She reached up and touched the device behind her ear with one small finger, curious and uncertain. But she did not, as the months of therapy unfolded, progress the way Marcus had hoped. She was not one of the children who caught up quickly. The auditory pathways in her brain, unaccustomed to sound for the first years of her life, worked hard to make sense of the signals they were receiving, and she made progress, real, measurable, documented progress. But it was slow, and the implant, so for reasons the audiologists explained were common and manageable, but that Marcus experienced as yet another failure of a system he was paying an extraordinary amount of money to make work, gave Lily something closer to awareness of sound than the rich, detailed hearing that Marcus had prayed for. She could detect voices. She could respond to her name in a quiet room. She could hear some music. But language through the implant was a struggle, and the silence was still very much present in her daily life. Sandra left when Lily was 3 years old. She did not leave without pain, and she did not leave without love. And the account of what ended their marriage is one that belongs entirely to Marcus and Sandra and should not be simplified into a single cause. What can be said is that the weight of grief are expressed so differently between two people who loved the same child with the same ferocity but could not find the same language for that love eventually became heavier than the marriage could hold. They agreed on shared custody. They agreed that Lily would spend the school year in Connecticut with Marcus and summers and holidays in Portland with Sandra. They agreed to remain cooperative and present and to never use their daughter as a messenger between their separate grief. They kept those agreements mostly, and Marcus poured every ounce of what had previously gone into the marriage directly into his pursuit of an answer for Lily. Over the next 6 years, Marcus Hale spent close to $2 million on his daughter's hearing. That number is not an exaggeration, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Harada, because it tells you something important about the kind of father he was and the kind of trap he had built for himself. He hired a full-time sign language interpreter who traveled with Lily to school and appointments and social activities. He hired a private speech and language pathologist who worked with Lily 6 days a week. He enrolled her in a specialized school for children with hearing loss during the week and flew in consultants on weekends from programs at Gallaudet University and from centers in Boston and Chicago and Atlanta. He took her to audiologists in London and Zurich. He funded a small research program at a university in Massachusetts studying the neurological plasticity of children with cochlear implants because someone at a conference told him it might eventually lead to a better calibration protocol that could help kids like Lily. He did all of this not because money meant nothing to him. He had worked too hard for it to mean nothing, but because the alternative to spending it was accepting what he was not prepared to accept. And through all of it, through every appointment and flight and consultation and invoice, the answer he was looking for remained just out of reach. The doctors were not unkind. They were not dismissive. They were working within the limits of their knowledge and their tools, and the genuine complexity of what was happening in Lily's auditory system. But the word they kept returning to, the word that had followed Marcus since that parking structure office 6 weeks after Lily was born, the word that had shaped the last 9 years of his life, was permanent. This is permanent. The hearing loss is permanent. The limitation is permanent. This is as good as it is going to get. Learn to accept it. Marcus could not accept it. He had never accepted anything in his life, and he was not about to start. What Marcus did not know, what none of the doctors knew, because none of them had looked closely enough at the right thing, was that something else was happening inside Lily's right ear. Something that had been there, building slowly and silently, for years. Something that was not a mystery of neuroscience or a limitation of technology or a question of auditory nerve plasticity, but something that was, at its core, terrifyingly simple, and something that a 31-year-old woman named Grace Osei, who had never attended medical school, who had no clinical training, who had no credentials beyond the fierce and unquantifiable quality of her attention, was about to notice. But before we get to Grace, you need to understand who Lily was, because in every story like this one, there is a child at the center, and that child is almost always described in terms of their limitation, what they can't do, what they lack, what they're missing. And Lily Hale, to anyone who described her that way, was getting her wrong. Lily was 9 years old in the October that Grace arrived. She was small for her age. With her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and a mass of black hair, she refused to let anyone cut below her shoulders because she had opinions about her appearance that she communicated with a clarity that made the adults around her feel slightly foolish for having tried. She had been wearing her cochlear implant since she was 2.5, and she had mixed feelings about it that she expressed to no one directly, but that were evident in the way she sometimes removed it in the afternoons when she got home from school and set it on her dresser with a finality that suggested she had had quite enough of the hearing world for one day. She communicated in American Sign Language, which she had learned alongside spoken English from the time she was an infant, and her signing was fast and fluid and grammatically precise, in a way that made her interpreter, a young man named Daniel who had been working with the family for 2 years, look slightly behind her in conversations. She had an IQ that the school psychologist who tested her described to Marcus, in the careful language of professional understatement, as in the exceptionally high range, which Marcus had stared at for a long moment before the pride overtook everything else. She loved architecture. She had been drawing floor plans since she was 6, not the simple rectangles of a child's imagination, but detailed proportional sketches with labeled rooms and annotated structural features that she studied for technical accuracy using books she borrowed from the library and cross-referenced with photographs she found online. She had a collection of model houses that she had constructed from kits but then systematically modified, removing walls and adding windows and rerouting stairs until the models bore no resemblance to the original designs. She loved to be outside in the late afternoon, particularly in autumn, when the light came in at an angle across the estate grounds and the leaves were doing what Connecticut leaves do in October, which is to say they put on a display so excessive and gorgeous that even a child who had seen it every year of her life could be stopped by it. She pressed her bare feet against the cold ground when she was outside and felt the world through the soles of her feet, the vibrations of wind in the trees and passing cars on the road beyond the property line, and occasionally music from the gardener's small speaker, which she could feel as a low and pleasant hum that she could not have described, but that she returned to whenever she could. She also, every few minutes throughout the day, pressed her right hand gently against her right ear. It was a habit. It was a reflex. It was something she had been doing for so long that no one in the house noticed it anymore. The way people stop noticing things that have always been present. But underneath that habit was something real. A pressure, a pain, low-grade and persistent, that she had tried to communicate in the ways available to her, through signs, through the notes she left on her sketchpad, through the expressions on her face that she could not always control, and that had been, in the gentle and well-meaning and catastrophically incomplete manner of the adults around her. Out-addressed and dismissed and addressed again, and ultimately filed away under the category of things Lily was managing. She was managing it. She always managed it. That was who Lily Hale was. She managed things. She adapted. She found other ways. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was building her own world very carefully with the tools she had. But in the sketchbook she kept in her room, in the pages between the floor plans, in the architectural studies, she had been drawing the same image over and over for the better part of a year. A careful cross-section of an ear, the kind you would find in a medical textbook, precise and anatomically considered, because Lily had found a medical textbook in the school library and studied it with the same focus she brought to everything else. And inside the ear canal, drawn in heavy dark pencil, one of a small and dense and oval shape, she drew it 47 times in 3 different sketchbooks. Underneath, in her careful and architectural handwriting, 4 words. I think it's this. She had been trying to tell them, in the only language she had left when all the other ones weren't working, and not one person in her life had looked closely enough to see it. Not until Grace Osei was born in Accra, Ghana in 1991, the oldest of 3 children, and she came to the United States with her mother and siblings in 2007 when she was 16 years old, settling in a neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey, where her mother's sister had been living for a decade and had built something close to a life. The immigration was not easy. It was not the kind of immigration that gets described in the language of opportunity and possibility, though those things were present too, buried under the more immediate difficulties of language and documentation, and the specific exhaustion of learning how to exist in a country that does not always make it easy for people like you to exist in it. Grace's mother worked. She worked constantly in ways and hours that Grace, who was doing the same thing by the time she was 17, understood in her bones. They worked together and they held things together, and Grace, who was the oldest, understood from a young age that holding things together was her primary function in the world, and she was good at it, and she was proud of being good at it, and she sometimes, in the quietest part of the night, wondered what she might have been allowed to become if holding things together had not been required of her quite so urgently from quite so early on. She had wanted to be a doctor. She had wanted it the way she imagined Marcus Hale had wanted his fortune, with a clarity and intensity that did not leave room for alternatives. But the money for medical school was not there, And the loans required to bridge that gap were not a risk she could take when other people depended on her income. And so she did what a lot of people who wanted to be doctors and couldn't afford to do it found themselves doing. She went into caregiving. She worked in community health programs. She worked in home care. She worked in facilities and households and settings where her capacity to see what was happening with a person, asked to notice the things that got missed in the 15-minute doctor's appointment or the rushed nursing home check-in, was not just useful, but sometimes the difference between something getting caught and something getting worse. She was good at her job in the way that people are good at something when they were built for a version of it that circumstances would not allow them to reach. She was thorough and precise and deeply, almost unusually attentive, and she cared, which sounds like a small thing to say about a person, but is actually one of the rarest qualities in the world, particularly when the caring is extended to people whose suffering is not your problem and whose gratitude cannot be guaranteed. When Grace answered the job listing for a housekeeper at a private estate in Hartford, Connecticut, in October of 2022, so she was not looking for a calling. She was looking for a paycheck. Her younger brother, Isaiah, was finishing his second year of college at Rutgers University on a partial scholarship, and the gap between what the scholarship covered and what it actually cost to keep him there was $500 a month that Grace had been covering from her own income. Her grandmother, her father's mother, a woman named Abina, who had come to the United States a decade after Grace's family, and who was now 81 years old and sharp as a blade in her mind, but increasingly limited in her body, was in a nursing home in Newark that cost more than Grace wanted to calculate. The job in Hartford paid nearly 3 times what Grace had been making in her previous position, and it included housing on the estate property, which meant her own rent disappeared from her budget, which meant the math, for the first time in several years, began to work. She took the interview. She took the job. She drove to Hartford on a Tuesday morning in October with her clothes in 2 duffel bags and her grandmother's Bible in her shoulder bag and a photograph of her family tucked in the front pocket of that bag. And she told herself that this was a job, not a story, and that she was going to keep her head down and do what she was paid to do and stay out of whatever was happening in that house. Because rich people's problems were rich people's problems, and she had enough of her own. She lasted approximately 4 days before the plan fell apart. Not because she went looking for trouble, not because she was careless or impulsive or foolish, but because Grace Osei was constitutionally incapable of being in the presence of a child in pain and not noticing. It was not a choice she made. It was not a decision she arrived at through reasoning. It was a reflex as involuntary as breathing, and it activated the first time she saw Lily Hale sitting on the bottom step of the main staircase on Grace's second morning in the house, working on a drawing in her sketchbook, and lifted her right hand to press against her right ear for just a moment, winced almost imperceptibly, and went back to drawing as if nothing had happened. Grace saw it across the length of a long hallway. She kept walking. She kept her head down. She did not say anything because it was not her business, and she had been told very clearly by Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, a woman of approximately 60 with the bearing of a retired general in the communicative warmth of a parking ticket, that the Hale household ran on the principle that staff maintained a professional distance from the family at all times, and that the last housekeeper who had failed to observe this principle had been shown the door within a week of her transgression. Grace had nodded. She had understood. She had meant to comply. And she might have, if Lily had been anyone else. But Lily kept pressing her ear. She did it at breakfast. She did it in the sunroom where she worked on her models after school. She did it at the kitchen table when she was doing her homework. She did it at a frequency and a regularity that Grace, who had worked in enough care settings to recognize a chronic symptom when she saw one, who could not square with the official story of Lily's deafness as a permanent and fully understood and medically managed condition. Something was bothering that child, something physical, something present, something ongoing. And the more Grace watched, and she watched carefully, because watching carefully was what she did, the more she began to feel the specific unease of a person who suspects that something important is being overlooked. There was a memory that kept coming back to Grace during those first days at the Hale estate, a memory of her cousin Kwame, her mother's nephew, who had grown up in Accra and who had been deaf from the age of 3 following a severe ear infection that the family had not been able to afford to treat properly at the time. For 6 years, Kwame had lived in the same silence Lily lived in. And he had gone to a school for the deaf. He had learned to sign. He had built a life inside the walls of what everyone around him had accepted as permanent limitation. And then, when Kwame was 9, not through a doctor's appointment or a specialist recommendation, but through a visiting medical volunteer at a community clinic who was doing routine screenings and happened to look into Kwame's ear with an otoscope, the truth was discovered. There was a blockage, a substantial, long-standing, impacted buildup of material deep in Kwame's ear canal, pressing against his eardrum with enough force to create a near-total obstruction of sound. It had been there for years. It had built up gradually, the way these things do, and it had hardened. And it had gone undetected in part because the assumption of permanent sensorineural hearing loss following his childhood infection had preceded every examination that came after it. And when a doctor goes into an examination already certain of what they will find, they sometimes stop looking for what they are not expecting. The clinic volunteer looked without assumptions. She saw what was there. And after a simple procedure that took less than 20 minutes, Kwame heard his mother's voice for the first time in 6 years. Grace had been 12 years old when it happened. She had not been present for the procedure, but she had been present the first time Kwame heard Grace's mother say his name across a room, and she had watched his face do something that no face she had ever seen had done before or since. She had never forgotten it. And standing in the hallway of the Hale estate, watching Lily press her palm against her ear for the 3rd time in an hour, Grace Osei felt something she had not felt since she was 12 years old standing in that room in Accra. She felt recognition, not certainty. She was not a doctor. She was not making a diagnosis. She was not claiming any expertise she did not have. But she felt, in the place where people who pay attention feel things before they can explain them, that something was wrong in a way that could possibly be made right. And that feeling was going to be very difficult to ignore. She tried. For 12 days she tried. She cleaned the floors and the windows and the bathrooms and the silver. She laundered the linens and organized the kitchen cupboards and stayed out of rooms when the family was in them. She watched Lily from the corners of hallways and from behind the counter that separated the kitchen from the dining area and from the window above the sink that looked out into the garden where Lily sometimes sat on a stone bench in the October afternoons with her bare feet on the grass. She counted the intervals between the moments when Lily touched her ear. On average, it was every 6 to 8 minutes. On days when Lily seemed tired, or when the house was louder than usual, when the heating system kicked on and sent vibrations through the floors, when the gardener's truck pulled up the drive, it was more frequent. Grace was keeping a mental log she had not consciously decided to keep, the way a person who is trained to observe cannot stop observing even when it would be more comfortable to look away. And then, on the 14th day, something happened that ended the period of Grace's uncertainty and made a decision for her that she might otherwise have spent weeks longer failing to make on her own. It was a Thursday morning in November, and Lily had left her sketchbook open on the kitchen table when she went to get her coat from the mudroom. Grace was wiping down the counters. She was not looking at the sketchbook. She was not trying to look at the sketchbook, but it was open in her peripheral vision, and the drawing on the open page was clear and large and precise, because everything Lily drew was clear and large and precise. And what Grace saw stopped her hand on the countertop and turned her body toward the table without her conscious instruction. It was an ear, drawn in cross-section, anatomically careful. The kind of illustration you would find in a medical reference book, which was precisely where Lily had found the model for it, because Grace would learn later that Lily had been to the school library and located an anatomy textbook and studied the relevant pages with the same focused intensity she brought to her architectural drawings. Inside the ear canal in the drawing, rendered in heavy dark pencil with a density that suggested many passes of the same stroke, was a small oval shape, unmistakable in its placement, unmistakable in what it was meant to represent. And underneath, in Lily's architectural handwriting, 4 words in careful block letters. I think it's this. Grace stood in that kitchen for a very long time, looking at those words. She heard Lily coming back from the mudroom, boots being pulled on, the zip of a jacket. She looked up. Lily was across the room, bundled for the cold, backpack on, not looking at her. Just a child getting ready to go to school. Just a 9-year-old girl who had drawn a picture of her own ear canal with a blockage marked inside it and written those 4 words underneath it, because she had run out of other ways to say what she was trying to say and was still, stubbornly, hopefully, leaving notes in the only language she had left. Grace pressed her hand flat against the kitchen counter and felt the solidity of it beneath her palm and thought about Kwame. She thought about the 6 years he had spent in silence that could have been fewer years if someone had looked. She thought about what it costs a child to spend 6 years, 9 years, any number of years, in a silence that does not have to be as complete as it is. And she thought about the drawing on the table. And she thought about what it means to know something and to say nothing. And she thought about Isaiah's tuition and her grandmother's nursing home and Mrs. Patterson's warning and the paycheck she needed in a way that was not abstract or metaphorical, but immediate and physical and real. She thought about all of it, and then she folded the dishcloth she was holding, set it down on the counter next to the sink, and made a decision that she already knew was going to complicate her life in ways she could not fully predict. That evening, after Marcus had retreated to his study and the house had settled into its customary evening quiet, Grace sat down across from Lily at the kitchen table. She had brought a small notebook and a pen. She wrote, "Can I look at your ear? Naren, I think I might understand what's happening." She slid the notebook across the table and watched Lily read it. Lily's face went through several things in quick succession: surprise, caution, the careful evaluation of a person who has been handled by a great many adults and has become expert at reading whether an adult's attention is going to cost her something. Then slowly the expression settled into something that Grace would later describe, to herself and to no one else, as the look of a child deciding to try one more time. Lily nodded. Grace was gentle and slow, and she narrated everything she was doing, writing it on the notebook page before she did it. She tilted Lily's head carefully toward the lamp that hung low over the table, and she looked. She had a small flashlight she had brought from the first aid kit in the utility room, and she used it, and she adjusted the angle twice, and then she went very still, because what she saw was there, unmistakably there, exactly where Lily had drawn it. Deep in the right ear canal, in addition to and behind the Cochlear implant that Marcus had installed when Lily was 2.5, there was a buildup, dense and dark and substantial, impacted against the tissue of the canal, pressing against the infrastructure of the implant, blocking the very pathway that the implant was meant to stimulate. Grace had no instruments. She had no training in otoscopic examination. She had a flashlight and the knowledge of what she was looking for, because a 12-year-old version of herself had once watched a clinic volunteer find the same thing in her cousin's ear. But the angle of the light was right and the evidence was clear, and Grace sat back from the examination and pressed her hands flat on the table and felt something that was simultaneously the lightest and the heaviest thing she had felt in a very long time. She was right. She had been right, and everything was about to get much harder. She went to Marcus the next morning. She requested 5 minutes of his time through Mrs. Patterson, who conveyed the request with the expression of a person who had already decided it was a mistake. Marcus received her in the hallway outside his study, which was a signal Grace read correctly. He was giving her the minimum configuration of his attention that politeness required. She had prepared carefully. She had written notes on a folded piece of paper in her pocket. She had practiced what she was going to say. She showed him the page from Lily's sketchbook, the drawing with those 4 words which she had photographed on her phone. She told him about the buildup she had seen. She was careful and specific and did not use language beyond what she was qualified to use. She did not say she had made a diagnosis. She said she had observed something and that she believed it warranted a specific and targeted look by a medical professional. She mentioned her cousin Kwame. She said the word impaction, which she had looked up and confirmed was the correct clinical term for what she believed she was seeing. So she asked Marcus to request that the next specialist appointment include a direct otoscopic examination of the right ear canal, specifically to assess for cerumen impaction behind and around the cochlear implant. She was calm. She was clear. She was, by every reasonable measure, compelling. Marcus listened. He thanked her. And then he called Dr. Callum Price. Dr. Callum Price was not a villain in the conventional sense of the word. He did not twirl a mustache. He did not plot or scheme with conscious malice. He was 61 years old, and he had been practicing otolaryngology for 32 years, and he had an office in Westport and a reputation that took up 2 full pages when you searched his name, and he had been managing Lily Hale's case for the past 4 years, which was to say he had been billing Marcus Hale's account at a rate of $2,400 per appointment, twice yearly, plus additional consultations for 4 years. And the relationship had been productive in the specific sense that it had produced a great deal of revenue and a great deal of language about ongoing management protocols and the importance of continued monitoring and the complexity of Lily's particular audiological profile. He was, in the vocabulary of his own professional self-image, a careful and thorough and responsible physician who took a long-view approach to complex pediatric hearing cases. What he was, in the vocabulary of what was actually happening, he was a man who had seen something in a scan 3 years earlier and had decided that the most professionally advantageous course of action was to note it, file it, and continue managing a case that, if that thing were addressed, would no longer require management. Marcus called him from the hallway outside his study, and Dr. Price listened to Marcus describe what the housekeeper had observed and what she had suggested, and he spoke in the voice he used for these conversations, which was measured and warm and faintly pitying, and he said what he needed to say to ensure that Marcus remained in his office and not in someone else's. He said it was natural tissue variation. He said it was commonly misidentified by untrained observers. He said that Lily's canal had been thoroughly examined and documented, and that there was no obstruction of clinical significance. He said that he understood Marcus's hope, and he said the word hope in the gentle way of a person who is asking you, kindly, to put that thing down. And he said that he thought it might be worth considering whether Marcus was allowing an understandable parental desire to manifest in the interpretation of information that was not actually there. He did not say these things cruelly. He said them in the voice of a trusted professional offering a reality correction to a worried parent. And Marcus, who had trusted this man with his daughter for 4 years, and who had been told by so many doctors over so many years that the answer was not there, that he had developed a complicated relationship with hope himself. Nyaj believed him. He did not fire Grace cruelly either. He was polite about it. He was in the way of people who have learned to deliver news they are not entirely comfortable delivering by wrapping it in pleasantness, almost gentle. He told her that he had spoken with his specialist and that her concern, while well-intentioned, was not consistent with the medical record. He told her that he appreciated the care she had shown and that he understood she meant well. He handed her a severance check that covered 3 months and told her she could take the week to collect her things. He did not meet her eyes when he said it. He was not in that moment the man he thought he was. And Grace, who had expected this and had prepared herself for it, and who was still somehow not entirely prepared for the specific weight of it, Arn took the check and thanked him and walked out through the front door of the Hale estate on a November morning that was cold enough to make her breath visible. And she stood on the driveway for a long moment and did not move. She had the check. She had her car. She had a decision to make about whether she was going to drive back to Newark and deposit the money and look for another job and tell herself she had done what she could, which was true, or whether she was going to do something else that she could not yet fully articulate, but that was already taking shape in the back of her mind with the inexorability of something that was going to happen, whether she cooperated with it or not. She got in the car. She drove. She found a diner 3 miles from the estate on Route 44, and she sat in a booth by the window and ordered coffee she did not drink, and looked at the check on the table in front of her, and thought about Lily pressing her hand against her ear. She thought about those 4 words in the sketchbook. She thought about Kwame, standing in a room in Accra, hearing his name for the first time in 6 years. She thought about what it costs a person to be right about something and to have the rightness of it dismissed. And she thought about what it costs a child to live in a pain and a silence that does not have to be as complete as it is. And she thought about the drawing. And she thought about what Grace, the quality and not the name, though the distance between them felt thin in that moment, actually required of a person. She thought about all of it for a long time. and she did not drive to Newark. 4 days after Grace left the estate, Marcus Hale's cell phone rang at 7:40 in the morning. He did not recognize the number. He almost did not answer. The woman on the other end of the call identified herself as Patricia Weston. She told him she had been a registered nurse in Dr. Callum Price's practice for 11 years. She told him she had left the practice 14 months ago under circumstances she described as involving a professional disagreement that she was willing to discuss in detail if he wanted to pursue things further. She told him she had been following the management of Lily Hale's case from a distance because she had been present for certain conversations about that case that she had not been comfortable with at the time and had become increasingly uncomfortable with in the 14 months since. And she told him she had kept a copy of a scan, a specific scan, a scan from 3 years earlier that documented something she believed he needed to know about, and that she had kept because she had a feeling, the professional kind, the kind that comes from 11 years of watching things happen in clinical settings and knowing when something is wrong, that the day would come when that document would matter. She would meet him wherever he wanted. She would bring the copy. She did not want money. She wanted him to know what she knew. Marcus met her that afternoon at a Panera Bread in Westport. She was in her 50s, neat and careful, and she slid a manila folder across the table before she said anything beyond hello. Inside was a printout of a scan of Lily's right ear, dated 3 years and 4 months earlier. And on the scan, circled in red pen, not the clinical notation, but a red pen added later by someone who wanted to make sure a certain thing was clearly visible, was a dense, clearly defined opacity in the right ear canal. And next to the circle, in the margin of the printout, typed in the clinical notes that had accompanied the scan in the original file, was a notation. Dense obstruction noted in right ear canal. Recommend immediate removal. Marcus read it. He read it again. He read it a third time. And below the clinical notation, in a handwritten addition that Patricia Weston told him she had watched Dr. Price write himself after reading the scan results, in the precise and recognizable handwriting of a man who had been managing Lily's case for 4 years, were 5 words that Marcus Hale read and then sat with in the specific silence of a person who has just had the architecture of 9 years rearranged by a sentence. The 5 words were these: family motivated. Continue current protocol. Patricia Weston did not say anything while Marcus sat with those 5 words. She was a nurse. She understood the value of silence in a moment of reckoning. She waited, and when Marcus finally looked up from the paper, she said quietly and without drama, he knew. He saw it 3 years ago, and he decided to leave it there. Marcus did not go back to the estate directly, and he sat in the parking lot of that Panera Bread for 45 minutes. He called his attorney. He called the hospital that Dr. Price was affiliated with and requested to speak with the chief of the Department of Otolaryngology. He called his daughter's school and spoke to the principal and asked them to tell Lily's interpreter that Lily would not be coming in for the rest of the week. And then he tried to call Grace Osei. Her phone went to voicemail. He left a message. He left another one. He left a third. And by the third one, he was not managing his voice the way he would normally manage his voice. And the words came out in a way that was not the way Marcus Hale normally spoke to anyone. And with a rawness that had no shape other than the shape of a man who had spent 9 years building a wall against something and had just watched it come down in an afternoon. He said he was sorry. He said he had been wrong. He said he had found the scan. He said he knew what Price had done. He said he needed her to come back. And then his phone buzzed with a text from the estate, and the words on the screen were 4 that stopped his breathing for a full second. Lily is not home. The interpreter had arrived at the school pickup location, and Lily had not been there. The school confirmed she had left the building at dismissal as normal. She was not in the car. She was not on the grounds of the estate. She was not anywhere that anyone could find her. She was 9 years old, and she was somewhere in November in Connecticut, and Marcus Hale, who had spent 9 years and $2 million trying to protect his daughter from everything he could not control, could not find her. Grace Osei, sitting in the booth of the diner 3 miles away, read the text that came through after the voicemails. 3 words: Lily is missing. She looked at the text for a moment. She looked at the coffee she had not drunk. She looked out the window at the parking lot and the gray November sky and the bare trees along Route 44. And then she put money on the table for the coffee, picked up her coat, and walked out of the diner. She did not put the coat on. She got in her car. She drove. She did not drive toward the interstate. She drove back toward the estate, and as she drove, she was thinking about the place she had watched Lily go. Twice in the 2 weeks Grace had been working there. A stone bench at the far northeastern corner of the estate grounds, set against a low stone wall under a stand of oak trees, far enough from the house that the vibrations of the heating system and the kitchen activity could not reach it. Grace had seen Lily sitting there both times with her bare feet pressed flat against the cold grass, and her face turned slightly upward toward the sky with an expression that Grace had recognized without being able to name it at the time, and could name now, in the car on Route 44, with her hands steady on the wheel, as the expression of someone reaching towards something just beyond what they could touch. She had been listening, in the only way available to her, with the soles of her feet and the tilt of her face, and the hope that the world, if she got still enough, might find a way to reach her. Grace parked on the road outside the estate property and went through the gate on foot. She walked to the northeastern corner with the trees. It was 4:40 in the afternoon, and the light was doing what November light in Connecticut does at 4:40, which is to say it was turning everything amber and low, and making the bare oak branches very precise against the sky. And on the stone bench, knees pulled up, sketchbook held against her chest, face white, lips bluish at the edges, sitting in near-freezing temperatures in a jacket that was not warm enough for the 2 hours she had apparently been there, was Lily Hale. She had the sketchbook held against her like a shield or an anchor or both. When she saw Grace coming through the trees, her whole body did something that Grace did not have a precise word for, but that her mother would have called in twi the release of a thing that has been held too long. She let go of it. She went soft with relief. She held up the sketchbook. On the cover, in the shaking letters of someone who has been cold for 2 hours and whose hands are not entirely cooperating, she had drawn two figures, a small one and a tall one, holding hands. And underneath, 4 words that made Grace's chest do something she could not have described to anyone. "I knew you'd come." Grace sat down on that bench and wrapped her arms around Lily Hale and held on. She held on the way you hold on to someone when you have been trying for days to convince yourself that it is not your job to hold on to them, and you have just definitively lost that argument with yourself. See, Lily leaned into her, and they sat like that for a while, neither of them moving, the November light going amber around them, the cold pressing in. And then there were footsteps on the frozen ground, fast and heavy, and Marcus Hale came through the trees looking like a man who had shed 10 years of careful self-presentation in a parking lot in Westport and had not had time to put them back on. He stopped when he saw them. He stood very still for a moment, looking at his daughter in the arms of the woman he had dismissed, and something crossed his face that Grace would think about later and would describe to herself as the particular expression of a person who is looking at the thing they almost lost and understanding for the first time its exact and irreplaceable weight. Lily heard him coming, or felt him, the vibration of his footsteps through the ground, and she turned. She looked at her father. She reached out one arm, still wrapped in Grace's coat sleeve, still small and cold. And Marcus Hale, $400 million and 9 years of desperate wrong turns behind him, walked across the frozen ground and got down on his knees in the leaves and reached for his daughter with both hands. For a long moment, none of them moved. And then Marcus looked up at Grace across Lily's head and said, in a voice that was not the one he used in offices or on the phone with attorneys or in the carpeted rooms of expensive hospitals, the voice underneath all those voices, the real one. "I read the scan. I know what Price did. I know what you were trying to tell me." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was Grace's severance check, torn in half. "Come back," he said. "Please come back." And Grace looked at the torn check, and then at the man holding it, and then at the child between them, who was watching her with those dark eyes that had already, in 9 years, seen more than most people see in a lifetime. And she thought about what her grandmother used to say, that God does not always send help in the form we are expecting, that sometimes he sends it through the people standing right in front of us, and that the question is never whether help is present, but whether we are humble enough to receive it. She took the torn check from Marcus's hand. She looked at Lily, and she said, in the voice she used when she was being honest about something, "Let's get her warm, and then let's get her heard." The surgery was scheduled for the following Thursday. Not with Dr. Price, who would spend the next 14 months defending his license before a medical board that would ultimately find that his documentation practices in the Hale case represented a significant and sanctionable departure from the standard of care, and not with anyone affiliated with his practice. Marcus called the head of pediatric otolaryngology at Boston Children's Hospital, whom he had met briefly at a conference 2 years earlier and had filed away in the category of people who seemed to know what they were talking about. And he explained the situation in the precise and controlled language he used when he needed something done immediately and correctly. The surgeon, a woman named Dr. Angela Torres, who had been performing ear procedures on children for 22 years, reviewed the scan, reviewed Lily's complete medical history, and called Marcus back within 4 hours to tell him that she would see Lily at the end of the week. She told him, in the direct manner of a person who does not soften things unnecessarily, that what she saw in the scan was consistent with a significant cerumen impaction complicated by the presence of the cochlear implant, which had over the years contributed to the buildup by disrupting the natural migration of wax out of the ear canal. She told him that this was a known complication, that it was manageable, and that she was not making any promises about outcomes because she never made promises about outcomes until she had looked herself. She told him to bring Lily on Thursday. She told him to bring the housekeeper if he thought it would help Lily feel safe, Marcus told Grace. Grace said she would be there. The procedure itself lasted 9 minutes. The operating suite at Boston Children's was very cold and very quiet and very organized. And Grace and Marcus sat in adjacent chairs in the waiting area outside it without speaking, because there was nothing left to say that the silence didn't already contain more honestly than words could. Marcus held the manila folder with the scan in his hands, not looking at it, just holding it, the way a person holds evidence of a thing they are still integrating. Grace had her hands folded in her lap and her grandmother's Bible in her bag, and she was not reading it, but she knew it was there, which was the important thing. They had been sitting for 7 minutes when Dr. Torres came out. She was still in her surgical gown. She did not say anything at first. She just looked at them for a moment, and then she nodded, a single slow nod, and what was on her face was not triumph. She was too experienced for triumph, but a kind of professional satisfaction that Grace had seen before in the faces of people who were good at something and had just successfully done it. "That's it," Dr. Torres said. "Went exactly as hoped. She's going to need a few minutes. Then you can go in." Marcus went in first. He had asked Grace if she minded, and she had shaken her head. And she had watched him walk through the door, and she had stayed in her chair, and she had pressed her hands together, and she had not prayed in the formal sense, but she had sent something out into the universe that had the shape of a prayer, even if it did not have the words. Inside the room, Marcus found Lily sitting up on the procedure table with her small hands flat in her lap, very still, in the way Lily was still when she was taking something in carefully. She had a look on her face that Marcus would try to describe later, to Sandra on the phone, and find that no description was adequate. The closest he came was this, like someone standing at a window that was always locked, feeling it open for the first time. He sat next to her on the edge of the table. He did not touch her. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and then he said, Ari quietly, just the two of them in the room where everything was about to become different, the simplest thing he could find to say. "Hi, sweetheart." Lily blinked. Her lips parted. The cochlear implant in her right ear, now unobstructed for the first time in years, was receiving the electrical signals generated by Marcus's voice and translating them into patterns of auditory nerve stimulation that her brain was, in this moment, encountering in a way it had never been able to encounter them before. The process of the brain learning to interpret sound is not instantaneous even when the signal arrives clearly. But some things arrive before the interpretation does. Some things register at a level that is more fundamental than cognitive processing. And what registered in Lily Hale's brain in that moment, what you transmitted through a cochlear implant that could now do something close to the thing it was designed to do, was the particular acoustic fingerprint of her father's voice. She had never heard it before. She would spend years learning to hear it better. But she heard it now for the first time in that room, and she said, in a voice that was rough and careful and new and absolutely, heartbreakingly her own, 3 words, "Is that you?" Marcus put his face in his hands and his shoulders shook, and Lily, who had been managing things and adapting and finding other ways for 9 years, did what she had always done with the people she loved most. She reached up and put her small palm on his back. She comforted him. Grace, watching from the doorway, wept without sound, because there are moments in life that are so precisely right, so overdue and so complete that the only honest response to them is exactly that: silence and tears, and the particular quality of gratitude that lives on the other side of a very long wait. In the weeks that followed, Lily heard rain for the first time. She heard it on the windows of the Hartford house on a Tuesday night in late November, and she sat on the window seat in her room with her feet pulled up and her forehead against the glass, and she listened to it for 40 minutes. She heard her father's laugh, which was loud and sudden and arrived without warning, and the first time it startled her, she signed to him with one hand pressed to her chest, the sign she had invented herself, for that was a good one. And Marcus laughed again, and she felt it the second time, not just in her feet through the floor, but in her ears. And in her face did something Marcus photographed without her knowing, and which he kept on his phone for the rest of his life. She heard music. Marcus played her the song he had been playing in the evenings for 9 years, low on the speakers in the study. The one he had played hoping that sound could find a way through when all the official routes had been declared closed. It turned out that it had always been there, waiting on the other side of a blockage that should have been found years earlier, and was finally, through the attention of a woman who had nothing but her own capacity to see, brought into the light. Dr. Callum Price's license was suspended 14 months later, pending the outcome of an investigation by the Connecticut Medical Examining Board that centered on the documentation discrepancies in the Hale case and 2 others that came to light during the review process. The civil case Marcus's attorney filed on Lily's behalf was settled out of court for an amount that Price's legal team strongly advised him not to contest. Patricia Weston, the nurse who had kept the scan, testified before the board. Her testimony was, by all accounts, precise and devastating. Marcus donated a substantial amount to the hospital at Boston Children's, where Dr. Torres practiced, without conditions and without fanfare, which was not how Marcus Hale had historically operated, and which suggested that something in him had shifted in the direction of a different understanding of what it means to actually help rather than to control. Grace Osei did not return to the estate as a housekeeper. Marcus offered her a position directing the foundation he established in the months following the procedure, a foundation that provided free pediatric hearing screenings and otological assessments to low-income children in Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, with a particular focus on children who had previously received diagnoses of permanent hearing loss and had not been reassessed since. The foundation was called the Lily Initiative. In its first 18 months, it screened over 4,000 children. 14 of them were found to have significant ear canal blockages that had been contributing to, or in some cases, entirely causing, their diagnosed hearing loss. 14 children, 14 families, 14 versions of a silence that did not have to be quite as total as it had been. Isaiah Osei, Grace's brother, graduated from Rutgers University the following May with a degree in public health. Grace was in the front row. Abina, their grandmother, watched the ceremony on a laptop in her room at the nursing home, which now had no outstanding balance on the account bearing Grace Osei's name. Sandra Hale flew in from Portland for Lily's 10th birthday, the first one Lily had been able to hear sung to her. And she and Marcus sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table and sang, "Happy Birthday," slightly out of sync with each other, and Lily signed, "You're both terrible," and then laughed so hard she knocked her own party hat sideways, and the laugh came out of her throat loud and unpolished and entirely joyful. And Marcus looked at Sandra over the candles, and they both understood, in the way of 2 people who had loved the same child through an impossible thing, that some things are worth every mile of the distance it takes to arrive at them. Lily Hale began 6th grade in September of the following year at a regular middle school in Hartford, with a cochlear implant that was now functioning as intended, and an audiological assessment that described her hearing as in the right ear, approaching functional levels for classroom participation. One she still signed. She would always sign. She did not put down the language she had built her life in simply because another one had become available. She was Lily. She had always been Lily. What changed was not who she was, but what the world around her could finally offer. And Grace Osei, who had shown up to clean floors and had instead changed the course of a life, sat in the foundation office on a morning in December and thought about what her grandmother had told her once. When Grace was young and uncertain and struggling to understand what she was supposed to do with the specific things she had been given, her grandmother had said, "God does not always answer the way we expect. Sometimes the answer comes through the person with the least to offer and the most to risk. Sometimes the miracle is not the technology or the money or the credentials. Sometimes it is just someone who refuses to stop looking." Grace had looked. That was all. She had looked and she had stayed. And when the cost of staying had threatened to become more than she could pay, she had looked again. And a little girl who had spent 9 years drawing pictures of the thing inside her own ear, trying to say what no one around her was positioned to hear, had finally been seen. That is not a small thing. In a world that moves very fast and pays attention to very little, that is, in fact, the whole thing. I want to ask you something before we go. Who in your life has been trying to tell you something, in whatever language they have, that you haven't been still enough to hear? Who around you sees what others have missed? Because sometimes the answer to a 9-year silence is not a better specialist. Sometimes it's just someone willing to look. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and leave their name in the comments. Someone in your life who sees what others miss. Give them their flowers right now today in this comments section, because people who pay attention deserve to be seen. Thank you for watching.